category. He's not a Jewish legal thinker like a Maimonides or a Joseph Soloveitchik or most Orthodox rabbis. He's not purely a political figure, because even though he was involved in politics and civil rights, that was just part of what he did. He's not simply a spiritual writer, because he wrote very, very academic, intellectual books as well. He transcends all these categories, which is just remarkable. So let me give a little bit of background on Heschel, so we can sort of get his life story a little bit. And then what I really want to do is look at some of his texts, his understanding, and discuss them. So he's born in 1907 in Warsaw, and he's born to a very prominent Hasidic family. His parents were actually related, and they were both go back to a very famous Rabbi, who was also known as Abraham Joshua Heschel, of the 18th century, who was of the same era as Nachman of Breslov, and he was a very respected, quoted Hasidic Rebbe. And these families were like dynasties, that the sons became rabbis, and one of the sons would be the Rebbe of the community, and it was a dynastic, sort of very privileged lineage. He grows up in that, and he is an extraordinary student from a young age. Eventually, he studies, he goes to yeshiva, he's very successful in the yeshiva, and he soon makes his way to Berlin. And in Berlin was like the capital city of the day. This is the early 1930s. And he goes to Berlin to get a PhD in Bible. Now, this is you don't see many Orthodox scholars today getting PhDs, but it was not uncommon back then. Another one of the students getting a PhD at the University of Berlin in a different topic, but still in Berlin at the same time, was the Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson, the late, great Rebbe of Chabad, was also in Berlin getting a PhD at the exact same time as Heschel. They were acquaintances. They weren't friends, but they were both from these very prominent Hasidic lineages, both studying at the sort of apex university of the day. So Heschel studies there. He also, while he's studying Bible, he writes poetry. He writes an entire book of Yiddish poetry, they're beautiful poems. They've since been translated into English. He studies there. He gets his doctorate. His thesis is on the prophets. And it's a beautiful book, written, I believe, initially in German. He spoke 5 languages and wrote in all. So he spoke German, Hebrew, Yiddish, English, one other. I forget the other language he spoke, but I remember reading he spoke 5, maybe French. I'm not positive, but he wrote primarily in Hebrew and English. English was not, of course, not his first language, but his writing is so beautiful. It is from a literary standpoint, his writing has a unique style. If you read his books, if you read quotes, you almost know when something is Heschel and when it's not. There's a whole book written about his style. I read the book. It's by Edward Kaplan, who's a professor of literature. And he wrote a book on Heschel called The Poetics of Piety. And he talked about Heschel's literary style. And the literary style it's very quotable. It's aphoristic. It has, there's parallel structures. There is a nuance to the language. Not everybody likes this style of writing, by the way. It's very, it's different than Hemingway. Hemingway is very clear, precise, almost like, just sort of descriptive and active. Doesn't have a poetic sensibility to it, whereas Heschel's does. Heschel's wife, who he met in Cincinnati, I'll get to that in a minute. Heschel's wife was a concert pianist, and she would be practicing Mozart and Bach and whoever while he was writing. So you can there's almost a musicality to his writing. So that is one of the reasons why he is still so celebrated and studied today, is the elegance and the beauty of his writing. So he's in Berlin, he's getting his PhD, he's teaching. In 1938, he's deported from Berlin. Obviously, 1938 is an awful year. It's when, the Nazi sort of, everyone knew what was coming, but it, got significantly worse in 1938. He is deported to Warsaw. In Warsaw, he teaches. He's working at a school. In between Berlin and Warsaw, he was actually in Frankfurt for a couple of years. He took over for Martin Buber. When Martin Buber moved to Israel, I think in 1937, Buber started teaching in his place in Frankfurt. But then he's deported from Frankfurt to Warsaw. He lives in Warsaw 8 months. 6 weeks before Germany invades Warsaw, Heschell is able to go to London. Miraculously, he's able to go to London on what's called the Refugee Scholars Visa. This was a special class of visas that allowed certain people who were considered great religious scholars to leave Europe. And the person really responsible for getting Heschell out was a man named Julian Morgenstern. Julian Morgenstern was the president of Hebrew Union College, and he was able to ensure that Heschell, along with another scholar named Alexander Gutmann, were able to come eventually to Cincinnati. But first it was London. Morgenstern was also the person responsible for getting student visas for Hermann Schallmann, of course, a very well-known Chicago rabbi, Gunther Plaut, very well-known Toronto, and a few others who were able to leave Germany. And this was all because of this one. This was a remarkable person. But Heschell goes to London. He lives in London for a few months and ultimately ends up going to Cincinnati to teach at the school. Now, 3 of his sisters and his mother all murdered in Warsaw and then in death camps. I don't know what exactly happened to his father. I think he was murdered as well, but I remember. So, he is virtually his entire family was killed in the Holocaust, which is interesting because he doesn't ever really write about the Holocaust, which is quite an interesting dichotomy in his life. Obviously, it's in the background of everything he writes, but he doesn't ever directly address it. He doesn't talk about, where was God during the Holocaust? That's, he addresses it through his poetic theology, but not in a clear, concrete way. So he goes to Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, he's like a fish out of water. He doesn't fit in. First of all, mainly because he's this, Rabbi-like figure in this very Midwestern town and school of classical Reform Judaism. So there's no kosher kitchen, and he keeps kosher, so he eats his meals in his room by himself. And he's sort of out of step with the students and the professors. There are a few students that grew close to him, including Arnold Jacob Wolff. Arnold Jacob Wolff was one of his last students, and Arnold worked for him. Arnold helped with his correspondence and things, at least according to Arnold. You don't exactly know how much of that is accurate, but this is what he told me. But I trust that they were close. I don't know how much Arnold did, but so Heschell is there for 6 years. Evidently, he's not the best teacher either. His teaching is sometimes kind of like his writing. It goes all over the place. Like when you read Heschel's writing, it's beautiful, as I said, but it's not always logical. It's not always, here's my main point, here are my supporting points, here's my conclusion. That's not how he writes. He writes sort of, he'll have a beautiful idea, and then he'll elaborate on that idea for 10 pages, and then he'll zoom back to an older idea and then move ahead. I mean, it's just, it's beautiful and it's innovative, but it's not clear. So I think his teaching was kind of like that too. Nevertheless, he eventually gets offered a job at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which is much more to his liking and to his character. So he moves to New York in 1946. His wife, though, is from Cincinnati. She's from an old German Jewish family in Cincinnati, so she's the concert pianist. They have one daughter who's still living. She's a wonderful scholar. She teaches at Dartmouth, Susanna Heschell. They move to New York, and Heschell becomes professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's a professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism. What a great title. But again, kind of like in Cincinnati, he's not really accepted all that much among his professors, among other professors. They don't quite know what to make of him. This is because here is this Rebbe-like figure, but he's also very modern. He is writing about spirituality. He is writing in a popular way. His first popular book comes out in 1951. Well, he has two books come out in 1951, The Sabbath and Man is Not Alone. And they're not scholarly works. They're not like, the biblical grammar of first century Hebraic text. And that's what most of the faculty at Jewish Theological Seminary is writing, those kind of books. He's writing these spirituality books. And yet he's from this very, prominent family. He's clearly knowledgeable. Nobody's saying he doesn't know his stuff, but he doesn't fit, again, into any of the traditional categories. One of his closest friends is actually Mordecai Kaplan. And Kaplan and Heschel are like polar opposite theologies. Kaplan is very rational. You read Kaplan's work, this is his point, these are his supporting points, this is his summary, this is his next point, these are his supporting points, this is his summary, here's how they connect. Kaplan is as mathematical a writer as you can find, and thinker. Kaplan has probably zero mystical, he's not a mystic, whereas Heschel is, but they get along. I think they kind of respect each other. They're both sort of fish out of water at the school. So he teaches there, and he teaches there until his death. He's a popular teacher, but again, he's not like, he didn't create all these acolytes. It wasn't like, we love Heschel, we're going to JTS because of Heschel. That wasn't how he was. He was almost in a kind of operating on a different plane. His main sort of where he kind of came into his own was through his first few books. And we're going to look at some quotes from those books. But the first two books was Man is Not Alone, which is his first sort of book about Jewish theology, and The Sabbath. The Sabbath is a book that essentially is a poem glorifying the seventh day of the week and what it means for Judaism. It's a beautiful short book. Then his second book, or his third book, but it's sort of the second in the series, is called God in Search of Man. And what's so important about this book is you can almost tell in the title itself that this is going to be a book of, in some ways, radical theology. Somebody characterized Heschel's theology as radical reverence. Isn't that a great phrase? Radical reverence. Because usually the two words don't go along with each other. Usually think of reverence as the opposite of radical. But Heschel was radically reverent. He believed he was not interested in proving the existence of God. That was an assumption for him. That would be like proving that we need to breathe in order to live. Or better yet, how do you prove that breath exists, air exists? Of course it exists. It's all around us. I mean, now with science, we can isolate it and see, you can measure it with different devices and things. But, 1,000 years ago, you wouldn't ask somebody, can you prove that there's breath in the world? Of course not. It's there. It's like we breathe intuitively. We don't need to be told to breathe. Just like Heschell believed, we don't need to be told that God exists. God is everything and everywhere. That is a ground-based assumption from Heschel's point of view. So you see that it's actually God in search of man being humanity in this case. Are we living in such a way that God will seek us out? That God is looking for this. God is looking for us. Are we responding to God's call? God is everywhere. God's message is loud and clear. It's in Torah. It's in the tradition. It's in the concept of tzaddikim, of justice and righteousness. But is God going to find anybody that's listening? So this is a radical, it's almost like turning theology on its head. And that's what he did in God in Search of Man. That might be one of the ways that Heschel really addresses the reality of the Holocaust. He would say that the Holocaust is not a problem for God, it's a problem for humanity. Human beings did this. God didn't. God's there. God gives up part of God's power so that human beings have free will. What we do with free will, that's our responsibility. So and then eventually Heschel writes a few more books. He writes an entire biography of Maimonides, which has still not been translated. It's only in Hebrew. Then he writes this magnificent book called Torah min hashamayim, which means Torah from heaven. This is his most scholarly work. It was only translated into Hebrew about, well, let's see, I bought it in 2006, right when it came out. I remember buying it because it was expensive. It was like $80 at the time, but I bought it because it was translated from Hebrew to English by a rabbi named Gordon Tucker. It took him 20 years to translate it. It's that the book is so scholarly, and Heschel wrote it in a style that's very difficult to translate. So, you know how if you're a native speaker of a language, you have certain abbreviations, like if you're texting with your grandkids or kids, there are abbreviations that you use or they use. And if you're within that worldview, you know what those abbreviations mean. Well, rabbinic Hebrew has a lot of those kind of abbreviations. So if you study a page of Talmud, there are all kinds of abbreviations and references, and that you have to really understand the whole context in order to translate. That's the kind of Hebrew Heschel wrote that book in. He wrote it in this very symbol-laden rabbinic Hebrew. And so Rabbi Tucker had to translate it to capture that nuance. So it took a long time, but it's a masterful work. And we're going to look at what he does in that work in a minute. So then he writes a few more books. Then in the 60s, he becomes involved in civil rights. He saw it as a issue of the times. He marches with Martin Luther King. We know there's some very historic photographs. He marches in Selma. He is anti-Vietnam. By the way, that it almost probably took more guts for him to oppose the Vietnam War than civil rights, because most of the organized Jewish community was supportive of the Vietnam War, because Israel was supportive of the Vietnam War. Israel was supportive of the Vietnam War pretty much till the end, because for a variety of reasons, mainly, that the communist influence in Egypt and the Middle East. And Heschel was actually criticized by Israeli embassy officials in the United States when he spoke out against the Vietnam War, because they said, you're hurting us. So that actually took, civil rights by the mid 60s, especially among sort of mainstream Jewish organizations, were generally pretty supportive of civil rights. Vietnam was a different matter. That was much more controversial, at least until the late 60s. But Heschel was, like Martin Luther King too. I mean, Martin Luther King faced a lot of opposition in the Black community when so this was a prophetic stance. It wasn't based on what was popular. It wasn't based on what he thought people would agree with. It was based on what he believe the prophets would say, which was really, that is a conviction that that sort of makes him stand out amongst others. He does all that. He continues to write and speak until he died, too early. He had not really been sick. He just, he died in his sleep on a Friday night on Shabbat, and his burial was a whole nother balagan, you might say, because there's a whole wing of his family that's still Hasidic. He's other parts of his family survived. So there's a whole group that wanted his sort of Jewish burial treated in this very Hasidic way. Then you've got the conservative movement that he was part of. Then you've got all these the people that were at his house soon after he died. One of them was one of the Berrigan brothers, priests, who were one of them was thrown in prison. These were anti-Vietnam priests. I mean, he had this unique coterie of friends. So that was sort of the struggle at Heschel's death. But in many ways, his influence has just grown with time. He's probably the most cited Jewish philosopher in the Christian community as well. Okay, I just covered a lot of biography. Any questions so far? I'm happy to answer any questions. Anybody? Okay, then let's look at some text. Okay, let's see here. I'm just going to pull up. Okay, we talked about this. We talked about this. Okay. Here we are. Here it is. Okay. Let me share my screen here. Oh, Ashley, can you enable screen sharing? Okay, let's see. Okay, share screen. Here we go. Okay. This is from his book, Torah Min HaShamayim, Torah from the Heavens. And this is his most scholarly book. This is where I want to start. This is his worldview. Okay, I'm going to read it, but you can see it right here. I'll highlight it so you know which one I'm talking about. When Rabbi Akiva found difficult or strange language in the Torah, his ears would widen. For in his view, strangeness in the text was a gateway to the discovery of the Torah's secrets. Rabbi Ishmael's goal was the integrity of the text. The Torah speaks in human language. If there is difficult or strange language in the Torah, then it is a mistake to take it at face value. Rabbi Ishmael would teach that Raz, that's a Hebrew word meaning secret, is an anagram for zar, which means bizarre, for a text should be interpreted according to its plain meaning. But Rabbi Akiva would teach that pashat, which means plain meaning, is an anagram for tipesh, for foolish, for truth cannot be grasped with nothing but the tongues of plain reason. Thus, there were thus two points of view among the sages. One, a transcendent point of view, comprising a method of thought always open to the higher realms, striving to understand matters of Torah through a supernal lens. And two, an immanent point of view, comprising a method of thought modest and confined, satisfied to understand matters of Torah through an earthly lens defined by human experience. Okay, this is let me summarize what he's trying to say here. Heschel believed that Judaism was a religion in polarities. So, like magnets. And on one side was the idea of a mystical, supernatural God. And this God, the words of Torah are like symbolic words that reveal much more than they seem to reveal. And this was the school of Rabbi Akiva. This is represented by Heschel, by Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is this extraordinary mystic. So if you look at Torah you see all the words have strange symbols and things over it. Rabbi Akiva taught that every single one of those symbols has significance. We have a couple of psychiatrists, therapists on this call. Every single word, when you're listening to a patient, it's like, you're analyzing everything they say. Every body motion has some significance. Well, Heschell believed that was the case or Akiba. We're not going to get to Heschell yet. Akiba believed every single scribble of Torah has divine significance. And that's our task, is to figure that out. Rabbi Ishmael was much more of a sort of dour, serious. He said, if something seems out of place, it's probably out of place. Not every single scribble has some divine significance. Just like not everything you utter is revealing some deep psychological truth. Sometimes you just say something, you're not sure why you say it, and you just say it. It just, and you chalk it up. It was a mistake, whatever it is. So these two schools of thought are at odds, according to, this is what Heschell believes characterizes Judaism. And what that means is you can look at the events of life from multiple different perspectives. This is a beautiful, think about what this allows Heschell to do. Heschell is trying to understand how to make sense of life. Think about, let's apply this thinking to civil rights. So from a very practical point of view, you could say the Torah is that the Jewish experience, or you could say the Jewish experience of history, teaches us that you cannot oppress the stranger, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Therefore, we should work for a society where the strangers are not oppressed, the outsider is not different, and therefore there should be a kind of equality. That's one point of view. But then Heschel the prophet, Heschel the mystic, would say this is a way of repairing the image of God in the world. That there is a prophetic, I think he actually saw civil rights movement in prophetic terms. That this is a movement to try to restore the image of God among humanity. And that someone like Martin Luther King was a prophetic figure in that way. That it wasn't simply about doing what's logical and right, but it was about doing something that's much, much deeper. And that's the Rabbi Akiba sensibility. So these two realms exist within Judaism. They're both true. Yeah, Sue.
I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, I downloaded the reading that you
Good.
had and I did start reading. I think I read about 45 pages of it.
Good.
And between that, what I've read and what you're saying now makes me think that Heschel, for a very orthodox person, was so different than most that we know, because he was so tolerant of everybody and really felt that we are all made in the image of God, and that he didn't look at Reform Jews as not being Jewish, as some ultra-Orthodox do.
Yeah.
Am I correct in my thinking?
100% correct. You want to hear a funny story? So Heschel was invited, I believe this was 1965 or 1966. He was invited to be a keynote speaker at both the Reformed Rabbis Convention and the Conservative Rabbis Convention in the same year. He was going to be a keynote speaker. And they were very close to each other. I think they were like a couple days apart. So he decided to do something. He gave the remarks that he had prepared for the Conservative Rabbis Association. He delivered them at the Reform Rabbis Association. And the remarks that he had prepared for the Reform Rabbis Convention, he delivered at the Conservative Rabbis Convention. Why would he do that? Well, at the Reform Rabbis Convention, he told them, using his remarks in the Conservative, he said, you need to take Jewish law more seriously. You need to take Jewish observance more seriously. Yes, you are great on civil rights and social justice and working towards a better world. You're helping lead that. But that's not all of what Judaism is. Judaism is also a deep sense of reverence for God and practice and experience and community and ritual. And you're missing that. So you need some of that. Then he went to the Conservative Rabbis Association. He said, you really care about Jewish law and Jewish practice, but you are missing the social justice element of Judaism, the ethics, the beauty, the sublime nature of humanity. You're great at the details, but you're missing the big picture. So this was the kind of figure he was. He did it in a gentle way. He wasn't a hit your head over it guy kind of person. That wasn't his style. His style was someone who lifted people up rather than pushing them down. So, but that was his nature. He accepted everybody, but he also had a vision of what was right and how Judaism should function in the world. You know, what God desired, essentially. He had this idea of polarities and balance, that any kind of extremism was wrong. The extremism of rigid orthodoxy was wrong, and the extremism of classical reform was wrong. You know, they were both, you know, there's a much broader array of Jewish life and meaning that Heschell really believed in. Other comments or questions? Well, speaking of that, let's go to the text. I'm going to open it up here so we can see it. See if we can share it on the screen. Okay, good. Can you see it? Okay, good. Okay. Now this introduction, by the way, I wanted to include this introduction. This is by Samuel Dresner. Samuel Dresner was the founding rabbi of Temple Moriah. Do you know that? It's interesting. He was the rabbi. He was the assistant rabbi at the Bethel in Northbrook, you know, he didn't get along with the head rabbi, and so I don't think he was the best people person. Dresner is a beautiful writer, as you could see, and he loved Heschel, but he was not the friendliest guy, from what I understand. But he was brilliant, and he ultimately left and started Moriah. But he was one of Heschel's closest students. And so he gathered this anthology of some of Heschel's writing. And that's why I love this book. And I wanted to share it with you because it's a great collection of quotes. You know, Heschel's got several books, as we know, but this one kind of brings in a lot of his thinking. So let's start with this first one about the ineffable. This was one of his most famous words, ineffable. The search of reason ends at the shore of the known. On the immense expanse beyond it, only the sense of the ineffable can glide. It alone knows the route to that which is remote from experience and understanding. Neither of them is amphibious. Reason cannot go beyond the shore, and the sense of the ineffable is at a place where we measure, where we weigh. We do not leave the shore of the known in search of adventure or suspense because of the failure of reason to answer our questions. We sail because our mind is like a fantastic seashell, and when applying our ear to its lips, we hear a perpetual murmur from the waves beyond the shore. Ooh. Citizens of two realms, we all must sustain a dual allegiance. We sense the ineffable in one realm, we name and exploit reality in the other. Between the two, we set up systems of reference, but we can never fill the gap. They are as far and as close to each other as time and calendar, as violin and melody, as life and what lies beyond the last breath. Ooh. What are your reactions to this? Okay, you know, not everybody loves Heschel. I should say, one of my friends, who's a very rational thinker, a very successful businessman, has done very well for himself, and he calls Heschel like Chinese food. Why does he call Heschel Chinese food? Because it tastes really, really good at the moment, and then you're hungry again an hour later. So he is not a huge fan of Heschel. I am. So I'll make my biases clear. I think his writing is not only elegant, but I think it's deep. But I think his style, it doesn't appeal to everybody. So if you don't like it, don't be afraid. If you don't like it, don't be afraid to say you don't like it, because I won't be offended at all, because I think it's important. Now, he doesn't appeal to everybody. But I want to know your reactions. What do you think of this? What does it say to you? How does it make you feel? What do you think he's saying?
Rabbi, Todd Rosenberg.
Hey, Todd.
Obviously, Heschel's very poetic. I mean, he comes from a Hasidic tradition, which is not the rationalist tradition, and you can see that in his writing and what have you. But he does kind of drive academics crazy, I think, including his daughter, who's more of a rationalist.
Yes.
But by the way, she taught at Case Western Reserve for the first 7 or 8 years.
Oh, wow.
Before she went to Dartmouth. Yeah. And she's still teaching at Dartmouth. As a matter of fact, my daughter's boyfriend took her for a class.
Oh.
But yeah, Heschel's style, other than when he gets to Heavenly Torah, which was a 3-volume set, which is a study of rabbinic concepts, it is much more rabbinic in style, but his theology is all very poetic.
Yes. Yeah, great point. So what he's saying here exactly is that every human being lives in 2 worlds at once, that there is a part of us that is rational and functioning. And, but by the way, just there's a very famous psychologist named Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize. And Daniel Kahneman talks about how we have 2 different types of brains. We have our slow thinking and fast thinking brain. Our fast thinking brain is like that intuitive sense, like you meet somebody and you form an immediate judgment about them. Like my mom always used to say, you got to make a good first impression. Somebody judges you pretty quickly. We all know that's true. So there's an immediate reaction, but then there's the reason reaction. And here Heschel is saying something somewhat similar. Every human being has sort of 2 parts of them. One part is this reason part, that knows we have to wake up in the morning, we have to, eat to survive, we have to get a certain number of calories to function and so forth, that, and we have to make a living in the world. But then there's a part of us that yearns for something more. That's the part that explains love, trust, honor, truth, spirituality. And we have to, there is no reasonable explanation for that. And we have to kind of listen for it, discern it. And remember, Heschel is writing in a period, he's writing in the 1950s, which was a period of, what's that book called? The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and the Organizational Man. This is an era when people were really worried or concerned about how a culture was becoming very conformist and utilitarian. And, everybody was thinking the same and acting the same. And Heschel is sort of questioning that sort of society. By the way, Shabbat, one of the things he talks about is that these 2 different worlds coexist in the Jewish concept of time. We have the 6 days of the week, the 6 rational days of the week, where you have to go and make a living. You have to do what you're supposed to do. That's the world of reason. Then there's Shabbat, which is the world of the ineffable. That's the world of mystery, of discerning, of the sublime. And we have to experience both. Again, this is the sort of polarities in balance, a kind of dialectical thinking that he believed was so characteristic of Judaism. This is different than Christianity. Christianity has a sort of almost a root kind of a belief in the sort of the supernatural, almost, I want to say absurd because that sounds insulting. I don't mean it, but sort of this sort of core value of resurrection, death and resurrection. That is sort of that's the root of Christianity. Heschel would say Judaism doesn't have one root; it has 2. It's these 2 it's sort of Sinai and Exodus, reason and revelation. That the two of them kind of create this sense of Judaism that's always dynamic, always going back and forth. You can't fix things in time. This is probably, you can never fix what Judaism is. Judaism is always dynamic and evolving. This is where he departs from orthodoxy. This is truly where he departs from orthodoxy. In fact, there's another article Heschell wrote. One of the big things that distinguishes Orthodox Judaism from non-Orthodox Judaism is the notion of revelation. It's called Torah Sinai. So in Orthodoxy, a fundamental principle is that God gave the entire Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, that all of the Torah is eternal directly from God. That is a fundamental assumption of Orthodoxy. Now, I'm not going to say all Orthodox Jews believe that, but Orthodoxy has that as a fundamental assumption. Most or non-Orthodox Judaism says Torah is divinely inspired, but Torah is the work of human beings. People wrote the Torah over time. Heschell kind of grabs a little middle ground. He said God wrote the Torah, but only one small part of the Torah. The only part that God wrote was the very first words of the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord thy God. That's it. That's the only part of the Torah God wrote. Everything else is commentary on that. So yes, God exists. God is out there. But everything we ever say about God is simply commentary. So that's the world of the ineffable. I am the Lord thy God. And then everything else is a response to that. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, here. Okay. Let's jump here. I wanted to get to beyond this. And I don't know. Okay. Move. Here we go. This is what I want to look at. Okay. The right of interpretation. This is what this is. We must beware lest we violate the holy, lest our dogmas overthink the mystery, lest our psalms sing it away. The right of interpretation is given only to one who covers his face, afraid to look at God, to one who, when the vision is forced upon him, says, I am undone, for mine eyes have seen the King. We can only drink the flow of thoughts out of the rock of their words. Okay. What is he saying here? He's saying that there is a purposeful ambiguity and lack of clarity in Judaism. That God's word is designed to be interpreted. That God never intended for us to follow the literal commandments of the law. That God offered the law in order to guide us in a way of thinking. And this is very consistent with traditional Judaism. Even though it might seem like he's being anti-traditionalist, he's not. The idea is that everything is meant to be interpreted. So for example, I was talking, this is a good story. I was talking with a bar mitzvah a kid yesterday, and we were talking, and I was, I like to get to know them a little bit. So I was asking the kid what he's interested in, outside of school. And he was telling me that he's really interested in science, and he's really interested in creation, and, how old is the universe, and studying the Big Bang and things like that. And I said, oh, that's, really interesting. And I told him that, in the Torah, we have the 7 days of creation. That God created, the world in these 7 days, first the oceans, then the land. If you want to teach at a Christian seminary like Wheaton College or somewhere else like that, an Orthodox Christian seminary, you have to sign a document that says you agree that God created Adam and Eve and that God created the world in 7 days. Like that's like a part of your job description. Like if you violate that, you can get fired, right? People have been fired. At an Orthodox seminary, you don't have to sign something like that. You have to be observant. You have to follow the law, but even in Orthodox seminary, you don't have to say God created the world in 7 days, because from its inception, Judaism saw things symbolically. So some of the early rabbis said each day, this is Maimonides, said each day of creation represents an era, represents a period of time. And so one could understand that creation is a long, drawn out process that most scientists say is now the case today, rather than a distinct event happening in 7 days. And Heschell would say that's how Judaism always has been. And that's how it has to be, because that's what preserves the mystery. You know, if you get married, you know, do you have a contract? Is there, you know, you have a ketubah, but is there a contract that says, okay, on Monday, Wednesdays, and Friday nights, he does the dishes. On Tuesday and Thursday, she does, you know, X number of days we go out to dinner. This number of days we travel. If, you know, if you don't make this amount of money, then that's grounds for a divorce. You know, nobody does that. That's not how a relationship works. There's a sense of mystery and acceptance and dynamism. That's not, that Heschell would say is the nature of Judaism as well. This dynamism within what we mean by faith. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions on this? I thought this passage was so, can you think of anything? I mean, when people ask you what does Judaism believe about God? What does Judaism believe about, you know, about orthodoxy? Or what do you say? Or what do you think Heschell would say? That's an easier question. What would Heschell say? What would Heschell say about, if Heschell had to give criticism? This is a question I thought about asking everybody this. I was going to ask it at the last session, but I think I'll ask it now. If Heschell could criticize Reform Judaism today, what do you think he would say? What are we doing that is too rigid, too formulaic? Where can we bring in more of the flow of thoughts and a sense of openness and vision? What do you think?
Rabbi, Todd Rosenberg again.
Yeah.
So, you know, when Heschel is marching, don't forget, you know, the big play that's out then is Fiddler on the Roof. And the theology of Fiddler on the Roof is Tevye, of course, saying on the one hand, on the other hand, right? He's talking about the polarity concept of Judaism. Big philosophy, obviously, that was expanded upon, as you were saying. It starts in the Talmud. But in the Middle Ages, there were 4 levels that were argued by commentators.
Yes.
So there was, let's call it the literal level, the pshat, the hints level, where you connect the dots, called remez. Then you get into the more abstract areas, midrash, and the secret level, which is Kabbalah. But so the rabbis really, you know, expanded that concept of 2 to 4 in terms of levels, at least. But of course, they were relying on comments from the Talmud. There's 70 interpretations of every text.
Yes. Yes.
Among others. And there's some people said there's 600,000. Of course, we know we're Jews, two Jews, 3 opinions. That puts in the millions, right? But be that as it may, we have a very, very, very flexible, elastic concept of interpretation in Judaism. And it goes back, 2,000 years, if not, much, much longer. Where traditional Christianity, particularly coming out of the Catholic Church, I mean, you had, nobody was reading the Bible in the Catholic Church. The priests kept that as their monopoly.
Yeah, that's right. They offered the authoritative there was only one interpretation, and it was theirs, whatever the authority said, whatever the bishop said.
And up till 1500, until you get Protestants, and they're starting to read the Bible, but even then they have their heavy hitters that are the authoritative ones.
Good.
We kind of never had that in Judaism. Yes, we had Maimonides, maybe, who was somewhat authoritative, but beyond Maimonides, I mean, everybody had their own school of thought, and we're Jews, we argue, right? So it was always extremely elastic.
That's right, and that's built into the tradition. In fact, just this week I was studying our Torah portion. Last week and one of the things, this Torah portion, we talk about the splitting of the sea, splitting of the Red Sea. Now, I was studying it, and there's a whole debate in the Midrash about how did the water split? How did that process happen? And the rabbis go back and forth. We might think to ourselves, oh, I've seen graphics that the water split so that one side was like one mountain on one side and one mountain on the other, and then there was a path that walked through, that the Israelites walked on dry land. That's how it's often interpreted, that they split apart, that the whole sea split apart at once, the waves were up on each side and they walked through. However, there are other rabbis that disagree, that say it actually, the sea split in segments. It was like after somebody walked 5 feet, then it split 5 feet more. And they walked another 5 feet and it split another 5 feet more. That it was a series of splits rather than one big split. And it was a great discussion. And the idea is that, you take one step at a time. That's what I often, people who are struggling with grief or struggling with addiction and loss, you have to take things one step at a time. Just like the Israelites, the sea was splitting. They did it one step at a time. And the reason I bring that up is not just because it's a beautiful midrash, but that it shows what you just pointed out, Todd, is that, there is a Jewish law that says you have to recall the Exodus 3 times a day. So we sing the Song of the Sea in traditional Judaism. We sing the Song of the Sea 3 times a day. That's Jewish law. That's what you have to do. But when you think about Jewish thought and midrash and legend, we can interpret things in many ways. So it's a balance. It's a balance that on one hand, we have Jewish law and certain practices. You can't say Shabbat. Oh yeah, I think I'm going to celebrate Shabbat on Monday. You can't do that. There are limits. Shabbat is Friday night to Saturday night. But when you say, what do I do on Shabbat? What are my practices? Oh, there's some flexibility. There's room. Okay. Well, Sue, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah. I had an interesting experience in talking about this and about interpretation. I had an argument many years ago with an Orthodox rabbi when I asked him, do you really believe that the earth was formed 5,700 and some years ago? And he said, absolutely, I do. I said, well, how can you believe that? He said, because my father told me, and my father would never lie to me.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, that's a different,
I really had a problem with that.
I agree with you. And I would say, I would have a problem with it too. And I would say, Orthodoxy has its varieties. We often think Reform, Conservative, Orthodoxy, but within Orthodoxy, there are many different shades of Orthodoxy. So he sounds like he was more on the anti-intellectual shade of Orthodoxy. I think if you ask Jonathan Sacks or Joseph Soloveitchik if they believe the world was created in 7 days, they would say no. They would say that's a metaphor. They would say certainly God created the world, but maybe God created the world through evolution or through the way things, so within Orthodoxy, there are different approaches. And it's not, it's not totally set, but there are people like this guy you talk to who are pretty rigid and anti-intellectual. I mean, by the way, that's sort of the problem. If you read the New York Times a few months ago, there was that whole expose about the ultra-Orthodox schools, that they're barely teaching any secular subjects, and they get money from New York State, which is that, they don't have to teach if they don't want to, but when they take money from government, from taxpayers, you kind of have to follow certain requirements, and they haven't been. So I think that's that anti-intellectual wing. Yeah. Marilyn.
Yes. Well, I liked when he speaks about the awesomeness and the wonder of each and every day. And it's not a normal response to think about God each and every day. But the beautiful prayer that Rabbi Ike always, and I've said this time and time again, this is the day the Lord hath made. let us rejoice and be glad. And then I always add, and do a mitzvah. And so I love Heschel's philosophy about piety leads to good deeds. And it's one thing to be pious and to, he talks a lot about the ego and to have your world revolve around you, but to reach out and have responsibility, participation, deeds of loving kindness, so that you can, at the end of life, you can close your eyes with a song in your heart, as he did, doing good in the world. And so I like that idea that he has about God's presence is with us. And you asked about Reform Judaism. Well, when I see the congregation come in droves early for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and fortunately your classes and the classes of our leadership have brought more people to study, and services on Zoom, and our leadership has brought a lot more people to worship services because of your leadership and inspiration. But Reform Judaism lacks a lot of that. Our congregation seems to be exceptional, and you're trying to be the Pied Piper and influence more and more as time goes on.
I would agree with you 100%. I think, I mean, most Reform Jews, and most of us are pretty secular generally, in our way of life, we feel a connection to Judaism, of course, or we wouldn't identify with a synagogue even. We feel a connection to Judaism, which is wonderful, but in some ways we're not religious in terms of the sense of spirituality. I think that's changing some. I think, we've got Ashley who teaches, Musar, and we have a music and meditation service that sort of.
But our congregation is exceptional.
Yeah. And there are some, but I think that's changing a little bit, but I think that's why, by the way, who was friendly with Heschel was Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton is a very important Catholic philosopher. Thomas Merton was a best-selling author who then became a Trappist monk. And he was very interested in meditation and Buddhism. But Heschel was writing in the era when there were a lot of Jews who became Buddhist because they found the spirituality in Buddhism that was lacking in Judaism. And so I think more people have kind of addressed that now, but it still exists. You're absolutely right. Todd, and then we'll conclude.
Well, I want to get your take as to why you think Heschel didn't go modern Orthodox. It's interesting when you were saying he was in Berlin at the same time as Soloveitchik, as well as the Rebbe, by the way. Yeah. Rebbe was there at the same time. They all got kicked out.
It's amazing.
Rebbe was a chemical engineer at the time before he became head of Chabad. But those other guys stayed in Orthodoxy. Heschel came out of that tradition. He goes to New York. He clearly, in the 50s, clearly, or 40s, as the case may be, he clearly could have gone to Yeshiva University or something like that. Why do you think he didn't go there? What was it about his theology that really prevented him from doing that?
I think it was something that Sue said earlier, that I think he was truly tolerant and open to the truth of other religions. I don't think he was a Jewish maximalist to the degree. I think he really believed that there were multiple paths to truth. And he believed in Jewish observance. He certainly believed in Shabbat and the mitzvot and the 613 commandments and so forth. And he never gave that up. But he didn't believe that we had a chosen, ultimately sanctified path to God. And that is a part of Orthodoxy. Some emphasize it more than others. And remember, modern Orthodoxy was not what it, there wasn't the kind of open Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy that we have today. I mean, there's a small wing of Orthodoxy today that's pretty open-minded. That really didn't exist back then. It did a little, but it wasn't a real movement. So I think Heschel just didn't identify with the Orthodox. He didn't identify with that exclusivist, sort of ultra traditional way of thinking. He identified with its practices and he identified with its devotion to God, but he didn't identify with its narrow theology. And so he didn't really feel at home in conservative either. JTS was probably the most scholarly of the seminaries, and there were Orthodox. So JTS was probably the place that kind of got the closest to encompassing all of his parts. But even then, he didn't feel totally at home at JTS. It was sort of a lonely soul. I think
man of faith.
yeah, which is soul of ages. I think he probably felt most at home with other Christian theologians. From what I read of him, I think he was, that he really felt most able to talk spirit. I mean, he felt at home in his Jewish observance, no question. But in terms of his spirituality, he was most comfortable with people like Martin Luther King or Reinhold Niebuhr. Yeah. Okay, Amy? Oh no, not who else had their hand? We have one more. Evie? No? Okay. Well, this will be a good place to stop then. It's such a great time discussing this with you. We'll go into some more of his books. Next week, what I want to do is actually look at his theology. Look at what he believed, this idea of God in search of man, and what that actually means. I can kind of summarize it, but it's more complicated than that. What is God's role if God is simply looking for us? Why should we say prayers to such a God? That seems odd. So we're going to look at what did Heschel actually teach and believe about Judaism. Okay, see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a good course.